Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church virtual Sunday service on what some folks celebrate as Easter Sunday. The Share the Plate recipient this month is the Meadville Teen Lounge, which is located in the basement of our church and operated by the Meadville Neighborhood Center. Please know that we continue to offer our financial gifts to sustain the work of the church in the community. And to donate electronically, please visit the church website. And you can also mail or bring your checks to the church. I want to let everyone who worked so hard on the garage sale for Cynthia Burton's estate that we have so far earned about $3,000, which is an amazing amount, and we still have more to sell. So stay tuned for the next stage of the estate sale. And thank you to everyone who put so much work into this. This was kind of a monumental task, and we really appreciate everyone's help. And now's the time when we say hello to one another as in the service. So greetings, everyone.
Hello.
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 Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Hello,
Good
hello.
morning, everybody.
Hello,
everybody.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Your practice went very well.
Yes.
Can I move it? You just don't have to, you know. The opening words this morning may be familiar to you because I'm sure all of us remember the Easter service we did last year when I used the very same words. So this is from the Jefferson Bible by Thomas Jefferson. I'll say a little bit more about that later. And this is what he wrote. I changed a couple of the words to make them more modern. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as in the manner of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb wherein never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus and rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and departed. And I added, the end. Thank you.
As Reverend Alex lights the chalice in the sanctuary, I invite you to light a chalice at home and join us in the chalice lighting words. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of life. And also, please join me at home for our unison affirmation of covenant and mission. Our covenant is to be a loving, joyful community that nurtures spiritual growth, promotes compassion, social responsibility, and service in an atmosphere of mutual trust. Our mission is to be a faith community devoted to love and respect, reason, and justice. And now the hymn for April, Wake Now My Senses, and many thanks to the Sunny Hill UU Church of South Hills, Pittsburgh for creating and sharing this video.
Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep our vow, giving, receiving as love shows us how. Wake now, my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Wake now, compassion, give heed to the cry. Voices of suffering fill the wide sky. Take as your neighbor both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now, my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Wake now, my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiance here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care.
The reading this morning, excuse me, is a pretty long one, and it's longer than usual. So I thank Jody for getting all this together. The reading is from the late Dr. Marcus Borg, who was one of my teachers at seminary, and some of you will remember the class that I did over a year ago. And this is what he wrote in a blog that he had written before he died. Paul experienced Jesus, though not as a physical bodily reality. It happened in a vision. And in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, his language is most naturally understood to mean that the experiences of Peter and Jesus' other disciples and others as well were visions. To those who might say, "You mean those were only visions?" I respond, anybody who has ever had a vision would not say, "It was no big deal, it was only a vision." Of course, some visions are hallucinations, an encounter with something that is not real. When this is the case, they are most often dysfunctional. But some visions carry a deep sense of an encounter with reality, and they are life-changing and not dysfunctional at all. For Jesus' followers, their visions led to the conviction: Jesus lives. He is a present reality, not just a much beloved figure of the past. So the questions for the breakout rooms, and you can always change them if you want. As you listen to the homily, please reflect on the following questions for conversation during the breakout rooms. Do you think resurrection as the return from apparent death is possible? Have you experienced it directly or otherwise? And I would add also here that there are many types of resurrection, and you can speak to those as well. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for being here this morning, and best wishes to everyone who's not here, members and friends of our congregation. Deb, thank you for leading the service today. And as always, to Amy and Kirsten for doing all the work they do to get these services ready. So the question's been on my mind when it comes to Easter for years. What do we do with resurrection as a word, as a symbol, especially when it comes to the issues, the great issues of death and life? Well, there's the resurrection with a large capital R that we all know about quite well. And then there's the resurrection with a small r, the one that calls us back to life in various ways. So let me start with the religious, faith-filled resurrection of the Jesus story that we know so well. The words from the Jefferson Bible ending are ones we heard before, as I mentioned, last Easter, which seems like a long time ago. Thomas Jefferson, like many of his contemporaries, was a deist. He viewed the idea of God as based upon reason and the observations of nature. It was more complex than that, but that's a basic way of saying what deism would be. And what he did was a very primitive cut and pasting of the Christian Testament. And he left out any miracles attributed to Jesus. For example, the bringing back of Lazarus from death and the other two people and all the miracles. That also included the resurrection story. He ended the Jefferson Bible at the tomb, and that was it. And many of our Unitarian, as opposed to Universalist congregations, have followed that path of rational philosophy for many, many years. They have focused more on the renewal of spring, the natural world, fertility, and oftentimes the beauty of Easter eggs. Some of our Christian Unitarian Universalist communities here in North America and also in Europe and the Philippines do celebrate Easter with the resurrection being a powerful centerpiece. And I'm saying resurrection with a capital R. What about the other side, our Universalist forebears? I would say generally that many of our Universalist congregations delighted in celebrating Easter as a powerful climax of the Jesus story. Now, caveat, they did not believe that, quote, Jesus Christ died for our sins, unquote. Why? Because Universalism believed that all were saved and would be eventually in heaven. Now, there were many theological arguments about how long that would take, but it was agreed that everyone would go to heaven. Reverend Scotty McLennan, who is a probably distant clan relative of mine, is a Unitarian Universalist minister who wrote in 2016 about Easter and resurrection. And I think he encapsulates what most of us think of resurrection as Unitarian Universalists. He writes in part, Unitarian Universalists primarily speak, if we use the term at all, of resurrection within our own lives before our physical death. The teachings of Jesus, the parables like the Good Samaritan, are teaching stories rather than actual events. They continue to have timeless lessons for us 2,100 years later. These moral teachings have become more popular and important in our Unitarian Universalist communities, especially in the 21st century, because I think many of our congregations are less annoyed, resentful, or disapproving of Christianity, or at least the story of Jesus. And the resurrection story is similar. We tiptoe around it, but not quite as much as we used to. Some of you will remember a class I taught 2 years ago, just before COVID, and I called it Jesus Reconsidered, using a book from the late Marcus Borg. And as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Borg was a liberal Lutheran religious historian, and the book was called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. Now, it happened that he was an adjunct faculty member when I was in seminary, and I did take a class with him. He spoke often of the resurrection with a big R as a parable rather than an actual physical event. Now, I will say that did not go over too terribly well with Christians, with students from the traditional Christian seminaries. We UU students, though, appreciated it greatly. But what he told us was that the visions of the disciples, of the followers of Jesus, the women and men both, were just as important, if not more important, than the resurrection. The reading that I used earlier from a later blog that Dr. Borg wrote before he died suggested how powerful the continuing spiritual presence of Jesus was to his followers. I'll repeat part of it again. To those who might say, "You mean those are only visions?" I respond, anyone who has ever had a vision would not say it was no big deal. It was only a vision. Of course, some visions are hallucinations, an encounter with something that is not real. And he goes on to say, when this is the case, they are most often dysfunctional. But some visions carry a deep sense of an encounter with reality, and they are life-changing and not dysfunctional at all. For Jesus' followers, their visions led to the conviction, Jesus lives. He is a present reality, not just a much-beloved figure of the past. Such visions, he writes elsewhere, are beyond physical time and space. They can happen as well today as they did 2,100 years ago. Okay, so much for the resurrection with a big R. What about the small r resurrections in our lives? The return from darkness, winter, death, despair, illness, and so on. Well, here I'm going to mention two stories, and we may give a flavor or at least an interpretation what resurrection with a small r might mean to at least some of us. The first story is from my chaplaincy training in 1991-92. I was a student chaplain at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. And one day I was on one of the floors going around to see patients. I think I may have mentioned this to some of you, so bear with me. One patient was recovering from heart surgery and she was in a private room. She was about 50, I'd say. Her chart said that she was of very limited reading or understanding skills. So I walked into the room and saw her with a coloring book and crayons in her bed, and she was busy coloring the book. She wasn't quite sure what a chaplain was, but she seemed comfortable with me after a few minutes. We spoke for a while. She asked me somewhat hesitantly if she could share a story. And I said, of course. She said that she didn't remember her heart surgery, but she did remember going on a trip, as in a dream. She said she was walking up a path, wondering where she was. It was very, very vivid. And there was a stream that went across the path in front of her. And as she got close to it, her long-deceased mother appeared in front of her. And her mother said in a very firm voice, "You get back there right now." She remembered nothing else until she woke up after the surgery. I asked her, how did she know the person was her mother? And she smiled and said, she always talked to me like that. I checked her chart again and said the surgery was complex and they nearly had lost her during the operation. Second story. The last time I spoke with Cynthia Burton before she died 2 weeks ago was by video. She wanted to tell me about a dream she'd had, and I think some of you heard this as well. She said a light had appeared to her, and she knew it was time to leave this life. Her story made me remember an incident early in my life that I didn't know consciously for many years. The details are not important anymore, but I had what I expect was a near-death experience, or NDE. What I remembered much later than its event early in my childhood was an orb of pearly white light. The only way I can describe it was a vastness of radiance, and I can still see it in my mind. I had some similar transcendent experiences when I was 4 years old and in my 30s. And I will add here that I was under no mind-altering substances any of those times. Were they figments of my imagination where my brain put together a pattern to understand what was going on? Maybe so. That's a possibility. Did that woman at the hospital, Cynthia, and I have visions? I can't speak for them, but for myself, I believe I did. Did they change our lives? For me, yes. I became far less fearful of death. I will do my best to walk with it when the time comes. And I gained some degree of awareness of how I think the future of humankind may be. Visions, reincarnation maybe, resurrection, and resurrection in all the ways we can think of. Coming out of addiction, coming out of illness, coming out of a relationship, entering a new job. These are all types of resurrection, leaving a past that is dead behind us and coming back to life. And what I believe now, as I believe for many years, is that it's a central Easter message for us all today, whether or not we believe in resurrection with a capital R or a small one. So, happy Easter, no matter whether you believe it or not. So, questions for the breakout rooms again. Do you think resurrection as a return from apparent death is possible? Have you experienced it directly or otherwise? And then I added, can you imagine any other types of resurrection that would make sense from your life experience? Thank you.
As Reverend Alex extinguishes the chalice in the sanctuary and we extinguish our chalices at home, join us in these closing words. Lead me from death to life, from falsehood to truth. Lead me from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead me from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts, our world, our universe.
I want to thank you all for coming on this Sunday, April 4th. In a moment here, I will recreate the breakout rooms for our half an hour coffee hour. If you're willing to stay, please join us for those. If not, have a wonderful rest of your Sunday, and we will see you next week. You can feel free to stay and wait, or you can exit, and we'll see you again soon.